Section 40 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA, Book 8, Chapter 9, Part 3, Spheres of Action, Witchcraft. The cautious and skeptical attitude assumed by the Suprema was all the more creditable because the leading authorities of the period were firm in their conviction of the reality of witchcraft. Arnaldo Albertino, himself an inquisitor, who, in 1521, had deemed the Sabbat an illusion, writing about 1535, says that since then, on mature consideration, he had reached the opposite opinion. He now accepts all the horrors and crimes ascribed to witches and argues away the canon episcopi. Alfonso de Castro, another writer of the highest distinction at this time, gives full credence to the most extravagant stories of the Sabbat, and he disposes of the canon episcopi by asserting that it referred to an entirely different sect. Notwithstanding all this, the Suprema pursued its course in restraining the cruel zeal of the tribunals. The craze was spreading in Catalonia, where it required the Barcelona tribunal to submit to it for confirmation all sentences in these cases. In 1537, it returned, July 11th, a number of sentences, with its decisions as to each and instructions as to the future. The tribunal was chafing under the unaccustomed restriction, and the fiscal was scandalized at the solicitude displayed for the friendless wretches who, everywhere but in Spain, were deprived of the most ordinary safeguards against injustice. But the imperturbable Suprema maintained its temperate wisdom. The utmost care, it said, was to be exercised to verify all testimony and to avoid conviction when this was insufficient. Arrests had been made on the mere reputation of being witches, for which the inquisitors were reproved and told that they must arrest no one on such grounds, nor on the testimony of accomplices, nor must those who denied their guilt be condemned as negativos. When anyone confessed to being present at the killing of children or damage to harvests, verification must be sought as to the death of the children at that time, and of what disease, and whether the crops had been injured. When such verification was made, arrests could follow, and, if the character of the case and of the accused required it, torture could be employed. It will be noted how much more scrupulous was the care enjoined in these cases than in those of Moriscos and Judaizers, and the limitation on the use of torture is especially observable, as that was the universal resort in witchcraft throughout Europe. It was difficult to enforce these rules in Barcelona. The result of the visitation of Francisco Vaca was a long series of rebukes in 1550, largely concerning the procedure in witch cases and eventually leading to the dismissal of Inquisitor Sarmiento, although his offences were simply what was regarded, everywhere but in Spain, as the plain duty of those engaged in a direct contest with Satan, represented by his instrument, the witch. Sarmiento is told that he made arrests without sufficient proofs and accepted the evidence taken by secular officials without verifying it, as required by the practice of the Inquisition, and, whereas the Suprema ordered certain precautions taken before concluding cases, he concluded them without doing so, and subjected parties to reconciliation and scourging that were not included in the sentence. Although the Suprema had ordered all sentences of relaxation to be submitted to it, he had relaxed 7 persons as witches, in disregard of this, and when repeatedly commanded to present himself, he had never done so. Then the fiscal was taken to task because he had been present at the examination of witches, conducting the interrogation himself, putting leading questions, telling them what to confess, and assuring them that this was not like a secular court, where those who confessed were executed. In the case of Juana, daughter of Benedita de Borgosera, he told her that she was a witch, that her mother had made her a witch, and had taken her to the Bac di Viterna, and he detailed to her the murders committed by her mother. In which cases he caused arrests without presenting clamosas or submitting evidence, but when he learned that a visitor was coming, he fabricated and inserted them in the papers. In this the notary del secreto was his accomplice, besides taking part in the examinations, bullying the accused and making them confess what was wanted by threats and suggestions. The alcaide of the prison had allowed one of the prisoners, who endeavored to save himself by accusing others, to enter the cells and persuade the prisoners to confess and not to revoke. The alcaide had also urged the women to confess, telling them that they were guilty and promising them release if they would confess, and, when taking back to his cell a man who had revoked his confession, he so threatened the poor wretch that he returned and withdrew his revocation. Elsewhere than in Spain, such methods of securing confession were the veriest commonplaces in witch trials. Meanwhile, the chronic witchcraft troubles in Navarre had called forth, in 1538, a series of enlightened instructions to Inquisitor Valdeolitas, who was sent with a special commission. He was told to pay no attention to the popular demand that all witches should be burnt, but to exercise the utmost discretion, for it was a most delicate matter, in which deception was easy. He was not to confiscate, but could impose fines to pay salaries. He was to explain to the more intelligent of the people that the destruction of harvests was due to the weather or to a visitation of God, for it happened where there were no witches, while the accusations of homicide required the most careful verification. The Malleus Maleficarum, that Bible of the witch-finder, was not to be believed in everything, for the writer was liable to be deceived like everyone else. The demands of the corregidors for the surrender of penitents, to be subsequently punished for their crimes, were not to be granted under the decision of the Congregation of 1526. Then, a year later, October 27, 1539, the Calahorra tribunal was notified that the Royal Council of Navarre had agreed to surrender 34 prisoners. One of the inquisitors was to go to Pampeluna to examine the cases. Those pertaining to the Inquisition were to be tried in strict conformity with the instructions, and the rest were to be left with the civil authorities. In the instructions to Valdeolitas there is a phrase of peculiar interest, prescribing special caution with regard to the dreams of the witches when they sally forth to the sabbat, as these are very deceitful. This, so far as I have observed, is the earliest official admission of the view taken in the Canon Episcopi that the midnight flights were illusions. We have seen how this was denied by Albertino and de Castro. Ciruelo admits that there are two ways in which the Zorguina attends the sabbat, one by personally flying, and the other by anointing herself and falling into a stupor when she is spiritually conveyed, but both are the work of the demon, and he admits of no distinction in the punishment. Bishop Simancas, also an inquisitor, has no doubt as to the bodily transportation of the witch to the sabbat. He admits that most jurists hold to the theory of illusion as expressed in the Canon Episcopi, but theologians, he says, are unanimous in maintaining the reality. He argues that the Canon Episcopi does not refer to witches, and that stupor with illusions is much more difficult to comprehend than the truth of the sabbat. With such a consensus of opinion as to the truth of the sabbat, or aquelarre, as it came to be called, from a Biscayan word signifying field of the goat, It is not surprising that the Suprema advanced slowly in designating it as an illusion, although practically its instructions assumed that no reliance was to be placed on the multitudinous testimony of its existence, of the foul horrors enacted there, and of the presence there of other votaries of Satan. A curious case, occurring at a somewhat later period, may be alluded to here as showing the conclusion reached on the subject, and as throwing light on the autosuggestion and hypnotic state which lay at the bottom of the sabbat, although its connection is merely with the carnal indulgence that formed a prominent feature of the nocturnal assemblies. In 1584, Anastasia Soriana, aged 28, wife of a peasant, denounced herself to the Murcia tribunal for having long maintained carnal relations with a demon. The tribunal wisely regarded the matter as an illusion and dismissed the case without action. 12 years later, in 1596, she presented herself to the tribunal of Toledo with the same self-accusation, and again, after due deliberation, she was discharged, although in any other land it would have gone hard with her. Meanwhile, the Suprema continued the good work of protecting so-called witches from the cruelty of the secular courts and of restraining the intemperate zeal of its own tribunals. The craze, in 1551, had extended to Galicia, where, at the time, there was no Inquisition. Many arrests had been made, and trials were in progress by the magistrates, when a cedula of August 27th, evidently drawn up by the Suprema for the signature of Prince Philip, addressed to all officials, informed them that the matter of witchcraft was a very delicate one, in which many judges had been deceived, wherefore, by the advice of the Inquisitor General, he ordered that all the testimony should be sent to the Suprema for its action, pending which the accused were to be kept under guard, without proceeding further with their cases or with others of the same nature. Then, in September 1555, the Suprema forwarded to the Logroño tribunal 2 memorials from some towns in Guipúzcoa with an expression of its sorrow that so many persons should have been so suddenly arrested, for from the testimony at hand and former experience, it thought that there was little basis for such action, and that wrong might be inflicted on many innocent persons. The evidence must be rigidly examined, and if it proved false, the prisoners must be discharged and the witnesses punished. If there was ground for prosecution, the trials might proceed, but the sentences must be submitted for confirmation, and no more arrests be made without forwarding the testimony and awaiting orders. 6 months later, in March 1556, the Suprema concluded that the cases had not been substantiated. More careful preliminary investigations were essential, for in so doubtful a matter, greater caution was needed than in other cases. End of section 40. Recording by Linda Johnson.